Some people hear humiliation. Quiet people hear everything. The Blackwood Grand Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and gold-tinted light as Manhattan's elite filled the ballroom with expensive laughter and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Waiters moved like shadows between tables draped in white linen while a string quartet played near the marble staircase. Claire Whitmore kept her eyes lowered as she carried a silver tray through the crowd, careful not to disturb anyone important. At 28, she had mastered invisibility. The wealthy guests barely looked at her except when they needed another drink or wanted to complain about something trivial. Her blonde hair was tied neatly at the back of her neck. Her black uniform was pressed perfectly despite the exhaustion in her shoulders from a 12-hour shift. Across the room, Ethan Blackwell stood near the center table, surrounded by investors and executives in tailored suits worth more than most people's rent. The billionaire CEO looked exactly like the magazines described him. Sharp jaw, steel gray eyes, cold composure. The kind of man who made entire rooms adjust themselves around him without raising his voice once. Claire approached the table quietly with fresh, sparkling water. One of the executives leaned back too quickly while laughing at a joke, bumping her tray hard enough for water to spill across the edge of the table and onto his sleeve. Silence snapped across the group for half a second. Then came the sigh. Loud, annoyed, deliberate, unbelievable, the man muttered while dabbing his jacket with a napkin. Another executive chuckled into his whiskey glass. Maybe the hotel should hire servers who can walk in a straight line. A few others laughed softly. Not cruel enough to sound monstrous. Just polished enough to feel normal. Claire immediately reached for extra napkins. I'm very sorry, sir. Her voice stayed calm. Gentle. The executive barely looked at her. Of course you are. Someone farther down the table smirked. These places used to have standards. Ethan Blackwell said nothing. He simply adjusted the cuff of his Swiss watch while scanning a financial report on his phone. That somehow hurt more. Claire nodded once and cleaned the table in silence while the laughter slowly faded back into business conversations worth billions of dollars. Around them, the ballroom returned to life. Crystal lights shimmered overhead. A server passed carrying lobster appetizers. Somewhere near the orchestra, someone laughed too loudly at a joke about stock prices. Claire stepped away from the table with steady hands, but her fingers trembled slightly once she reached the service hallway. Ignore them, another waitress whispered beside her while stacking empty glasses. Claire forced a small smile. I'm fine. But she wasn't. Humiliation had weight. Quiet weight. The kind people carried without making a sound. Before the other waitress could answer, a sudden sharp noise echoed from the ballroom. A chair scraping violently against marble. Then another. Claire looked up immediately. Near the CEO's table, a small boy stood frozen beside his seat, both hands pressed tightly against his ears. The lights above the ballroom reflected harshly across his pale face, while conversations swelled louder around him. Noah, one of the women at the table whispered nervously. Sweetheart, look at me. But the boy didn't respond. He stared downward, breathing too fast. One executive sighed impatiently. Not again. Another guest awkwardly pretended not to notice. Claire watched the child carefully from across the room. The tight shoulders. The shallow breathing. The panic hidden beneath silence. Ethan finally stood from his chair. Noah. His tone was controlled, but something underneath it sounded tired. The boy flinched harder at the sound of his name. One of the hotel managers hurried over. Should we call someone? Ethan rubbed his forehead once. He just needs space. But space didn't exist inside a ballroom filled with 200 people, bright chandeliers, clinking silverware, and overlapping conversations. Noah looked smaller every second. Claire slowly set down the tray in her hands. The hallway around her faded into distant noise. She crossed the ballroom quietly while executives continued whispering among themselves. One woman glanced at Claire with confusion as the waitress approached the billionaire's table uninvited. Ethan looked up sharply the moment Claire stopped beside the boy. For 1 second, neither of them spoke. Then Claire slowly crouched down near Noah without touching him. Without forcing eye contact. Without panic. Her voice became almost invisible beneath the noise of the ballroom. Soft. Slow. Safe. You can cover your ears now, she whispered gently. I know the lights are too loud. Noah's breathing stopped hitching. The blue lights are the worst, Claire continued quietly. I don't like buzzing sounds either. The little boy blinked once. then slowly looked at her for the first time. The entire table fell silent. Claire glanced toward the chandelier overhead. Do you want to count them with me? Noah stared at her another second before giving the smallest nod. Claire pointed upward calmly. 1 light. 2 lights. 3. Noah swallowed hard. 4, he whispered. Ethan Blackwell froze completely. Because for the last 2 years, no specialist, therapist, or doctor had gotten his nephew to speak during an episode that quickly. But somehow, the quiet waitress everyone had ignored just did. The ballroom remained strangely quiet for several seconds after Noah whispered the word 4. Even the executives who had mocked Claire moments earlier seemed unsure where to look. The little boy kept his eyes fixed on the chandelier above them, while Claire continued counting softly beside him. 5 lights. 6 lights. 7. Noah's breathing slowed little by little. The tightness in his shoulders eased. His hands lowered from his ears just enough for the tension around Ethan Blackwell's face to shift for the first time that evening. Relief. Small. Barely visible. But real. Claire never touched the boy. She never rushed him. She simply stayed there beside him like someone who understood storms other people could not see. One of the women at the table exhaled shakily. That is the calmest he has been all night. Ethan did not answer. His gray eyes stayed fixed on Claire, studying her carefully now, not as background noise, not as another server moving through the ballroom unnoticed, but as a question he suddenly needed answered. Noah glanced toward Claire again. The lights buzz, he whispered quietly. Claire nodded once. I know. Everybody talks too loud. I know that too. The boy looked at her like she had just spoken a secret language nobody else could hear. Around them, the orchestra carefully resumed playing softer music while guests awkwardly returned to their conversations. But the atmosphere had changed. The room no longer belonged entirely to the wealthy people sitting beneath crystal chandeliers. Somehow, the quiet waitress kneeling beside the frightened child had shifted the center of gravity without raising her voice once. Claire slowly stood. You are doing really well, Noah. The boy reached for the sleeve of her uniform before she could step away. Tiny fingers. Hesitant. Will you stay? The question hit the table harder than any boardroom negotiation ever could. Ethan looked down immediately. Noah almost never asked strangers to stay. In fact, he rarely asked anyone. Claire glanced at Ethan for permission first. That detail did not escape him either. Respectful. Careful. Unassuming. Ethan finally nodded once. If she is willing. Claire gave Noah a small smile. I have work to finish, but I can stay for a few minutes. Noah relaxed visibly. One executive leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath. Probably embarrassment disguised as curiosity. Claire ignored both of them completely. Ethan pulled out the empty chair beside Noah. Sit. Claire hesitated briefly. I should not sit with guests. That stopped mattering about 5 minutes ago. Ethan replied quietly. The tone in his voice made the entire table still again. Claire sat carefully at the edge of the chair while Noah continued staring at the chandelier overhead. Do you always count lights? She asked gently. Noah nodded. Only when it gets loud. Claire looked around the ballroom thoughtfully. That makes sense. Big rooms feel heavy sometimes. Noah blinked. You know that. Very well. Ethan watched every word exchanged between them. Every pause. Every small movement. He noticed how Claire never overwhelmed the boy with too much eye contact. How her voice stayed low and even. How Noah responded to her almost immediately while ignoring everyone else at the table. One of the executives cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Whitmore, was it? Claire looked over politely. Yes, sir. How exactly do you know how to handle children like this? The wording hung in the air unpleasantly. Children like this. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the folded linen napkin resting in her lap. But her expression never changed. Sometimes people simply need someone to listen carefully. The executive frowned. That does not really answer the question. Ethan finally spoke before Claire could respond. Then perhaps it was not your question to ask. Silence dropped across the table instantly. The executive straightened in his chair and looked away toward his wine glass. Claire lowered her eyes quietly. Noah leaned slightly closer toward her. Can you do the rain thing again? Claire looked surprised. The rain thing? Noah nodded. With your fingers? Claire slowly lifted her hand and lightly tapped 2 fingers against the tablecloth in soft, uneven rhythms. Rain on windows, she whispered. Tap, 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 tap. Noah stared at her hand carefully, then copied the rhythm himself against the edge of the table. Tap, tap, tap. His breathing steadied even more. Ethan felt something uncomfortable twist quietly in his chest. For months, he had paid specialists thousands of dollars per hour trying to help his nephew reconnect with the world after the accident that took Noah's parents. Expensive offices, clinical voices, endless therapies. Yet none of them had reached the boy the way this waitress just had, with nothing more than patience and soft words about rain. Across the ballroom, the hotel manager suddenly appeared beside Claire, looking anxious. "Claire, table 14 still needs service." She stood immediately. "Of course." Noah's face tightened again. Claire crouched beside him one last time. "You are okay now." Noah looked uncertain. Claire gently pointed toward the water glass near him. "Can you do something for me?" He nodded slowly. "Every time the room feels too loud, count 3 things you can see and 3 things you can hear." "Just 3." Noah repeated softly. 3 and 3. "Exactly." Ethan watched the exchange carefully. Claire stood and reached for her serving tray again, like none of this had mattered. Like she fully intended to disappear back into the ballroom shadows the moment her shift resumed. But before she could walk away, Ethan spoke quietly behind her. "Miss Whitmore." Claire turned. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. "Thank you." For the first time that evening, Claire looked directly at him. Not impressed by his wealth. Not intimidated by his reputation. Just calm. "He only needed someone to slow the room down," she said softly. Then she walked back into the crowd while the billionaire CEO remained standing beside the table, watching the quiet woman everyone else had failed to notice. Rain pressed softly against the tall glass windows of the Blackwood Grand Hotel as the charity gala slowly dissolved into smaller conversations and late-night drinks. Most guests had returned to discussing mergers, stock projections, and vacation homes in Aspen, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But Ethan Blackwell could not stop watching the service hallway where Claire Whitmore had disappeared nearly 20 minutes earlier. Noah sat quietly beside him now, tracing invisible patterns against the white tablecloth with his fingertips. Calm. Present. That alone felt almost unreal. Ethan loosened his tie slightly, while one of his executives resumed talking about a Singapore acquisition deal. "If we move before fourth quarter, we could save nearly $12 million in taxes." Ethan did not answer. "Ethan." He blinked once and looked up. "What?" The executive exchanged a glance with another man. "You have not heard a single word we said." Ethan reached for his water glass. Then it probably was not important. Across the ballroom, Claire moved between tables carrying trays of empty champagne flutes with the same quiet rhythm she always had. Yet now Ethan noticed everything about her. The precision in her movements. The way she anticipated people stepping into her path before they did. The calmness in her posture despite the exhausting shift. Even after being humiliated earlier, she had never once looked angry. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Most people reacted to cruelty. Claire had simply absorbed it like rain against stone. Noah tugged lightly on Ethan's sleeve. "Where did she go?" Ethan glanced down. "Back to work." Noah frowned toward the crowded ballroom. "I do not like when she disappears." Ethan stared at his nephew for a moment. Noah had not connected this quickly with anyone since the accident 18 months earlier. After losing his parents in a winter highway collision, the little boy had withdrawn deeper into silence with every passing month. Therapists called it trauma adaptation. Doctors used phrases like sensory dysregulation and emotional distancing. But Ethan had watched it happen in simpler terms. Noah stopped laughing. Then he stopped talking. Then little by little, he stopped reaching for people altogether. Until tonight. Ethan looked across the ballroom again. Claire was speaking softly with an elderly couple near the dessert table. The old woman smiled warmly at something Claire said. Even from a distance, she seemed to make crowded rooms quieter around her. "Sir." Ethan turned slightly as his assistant approached the table holding a tablet. "Your car is ready whenever you are." Ethan nodded absently. "Thank you." Noah spoke before the assistant could leave. "Can Claire say goodbye first?" Ethan looked surprised. "You want to say goodbye to her?" Noah lowered his eyes toward the tablecloth. "She makes the noise smaller." Something tightened painfully in Ethan's chest again. Not guilt exactly. Something heavier. He looked toward the ballroom and spotted Claire disappearing through the kitchen doors with another tray. "Wait here," Ethan said quietly. The kitchen corridor behind the ballroom was warmer than the main dining hall. Stainless steel counters reflected bright overhead lights, while cooks moved quickly between ovens and prep stations. Claire stood near a coffee machine, carefully stacking ceramic cups onto a tray. She looked tired now that nobody was watching. One hand pressed briefly against the back of her neck before she reached for another stack of dishes. Ethan stopped several feet away. For the first time in years, he realized he did not entirely know how to begin a conversation without business attached to it. Claire noticed him a moment later and immediately straightened. "Mr. Blackwell." Her voice stayed professional. "Calm. Is something wrong?" Ethan glanced around the noisy kitchen. Noah wanted to say goodbye before we left. Something soft flickered across her face before disappearing again. "Oh." Ethan hesitated briefly. "You helped him tonight more than you probably realize." Claire lowered her eyes toward the tray in her hands. "He was overwhelmed. That is all." "No," Ethan said quietly. "That is not all." The kitchen noise seemed distant suddenly. Claire carefully placed another coffee cup onto the tray without looking up. Children usually calm down when someone listens to them instead of trying to control them. Ethan studied her expression. That sounded practiced. Claire gave a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Maybe it was. Ethan noticed the small scar near her wrist as she adjusted the tray. "Old. Faded. The kind life leaves behind quietly." "Have we met before?" he asked suddenly. Claire looked genuinely surprised. "No, sir. You seem familiar." "I think wealthy people say that when they finally notice service staff have faces." The answer was gentle, not rude, but it landed harder than criticism. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. "Fair point." Claire lifted the tray carefully. "I should get these upstairs before the next event starts." Ethan stepped aside automatically. But before she could walk past him, he spoke again. "You handled those men at my table with more grace than they deserved." Claire paused. People reveal themselves when they think someone beneath them cannot answer back. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He remembered the laughter, the comments, and worst of all, his own silence. Claire finally looked at him directly again. "The funny thing is," she continued softly, "children notice that faster than adults do." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Claire shifted the tray gently against her hip. Noah watched the entire room before he shut down. He heard every voice. But he also noticed who stayed quiet. The words settled between them heavily. Ethan felt heat rise behind his collar despite the cold air drifting from the kitchen vents. Because she was right. He had heard the humiliation. He had seen it. And he had done nothing. Claire seemed to realize she had said too much because her expression softened immediately afterward. "Good night, Mr. Blackwell." Then she walked past him carrying the tray carefully through the kitchen doors while Ethan remained standing alone beside the coffee station, listening to the distant sound of rain against the hotel windows and realizing he could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him with that kind of honesty. The city was still wet from the storm the next morning when Ethan Blackwell stepped into the 39th floor conference room overlooking Manhattan. Gray clouds drifted between glass skyscrapers while traffic crawled beneath them like slow rivers of light. Executives filled the long marble table with laptops, contracts, and expensive coffee. Numbers glowed across giant presentation screens. Quarterly forecasts, international expansion, profit margins. Normally, Ethan controlled rooms like this effortlessly. Today, he barely heard a word. "If we finalize the Zurich acquisition before December, we can increase projected revenue by nearly 18%, one executive explained confidently. Ethan stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows without responding. His assistant, Caroline, noticed immediately. "Mr. Blackwell?" Ethan blinked once. "Continue." But his mind was somewhere else entirely. Soft rain against hotel windows. A quiet waitress crouched beside a frightened child. You heard them laugh. But Noah heard me stay. The sentence had followed him home the night before and settled into every silent corner of his penthouse afterward. Ethan rarely lost sleep. He had built an empire by compartmentalizing emotion the same way surgeons compartmentalized fear. Efficiently, cleanly, necessary sacrifices for leadership. Yet sometime around 2 a.m, he found himself standing alone beside the kitchen counter, holding untouched coffee, while Noah slept quietly down the hallway for the first time in weeks. And all Ethan could think about was the look in Claire Whitmore's eyes when she said the word stay. "Sir," Caroline spoke again carefully. "The board is waiting for your decision." Ethan finally looked toward the screen. Rows of numbers stared back at him meaninglessly. Push the vote until Friday. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. Friday, one asked. We already have investors flying in from London. Ethan closed the folder in front of him. Then they can enjoy New York a little longer. Silence settled uneasily around the table. Ethan never delayed decisions. Ever. But before anyone could object further, his phone vibrated quietly against the marble surface. A message from Noah's private caregiver appeared on the screen. Noah ate breakfast this morning without prompting. Asked if the rain lady was okay. Ethan stared at the message longer than he should have. Rain lady. He stood suddenly. Meeting adjourned. Caroline hurried after him once he exited the conference room. Ethan, is everything all right? He slipped his coat on without slowing his pace. Find out everything you can about Claire Whitmore. Caroline frowned slightly. The waitress from last night. Yes. What exactly are we looking for? Ethan paused near the elevator. That was the problem. He did not know anything unusual. Caroline raised an eyebrow carefully. You think there is more to her? Ethan remembered the way Claire read Noah's distress before anyone else. The precision in her words. The calmness. The restraint. People did not accidentally learn those things. I think people do not survive humiliation that quietly unless life has taught them something much harder first. Caroline said nothing after that. She simply nodded once as the elevator doors closed between them. 3 hours later, Ethan sat alone in his office while cold coffee rested untouched beside stacks of contracts. Rain streaked slowly across the windows behind him. Manhattan looked blurred today, softer somehow. His computer screen remained open to financial reports he had not read. A knock sounded gently against the office door. Caroline entered carrying a thin black folder. I found her. Ethan looked up immediately. That was fast. There is not much online. She handed him the folder carefully, which is strange by itself. Ethan opened it slowly. Claire Whitmore, 28 years old. Current employment, Blackwood Grand Hotel. Previous jobs, restaurants, bookstores, temporary clerical work. No social media presence. No public interviews. No recent academic records. Ethan frowned. That cannot be right. Caroline nodded slightly. That is what I thought too. Ethan flipped another page. Columbia University? Full academic scholarship, Caroline explained. Behavioral psychology and childhood communication studies. Ethan looked up sharply. She studied child behavioral communication? Top of her department according to archived university records. Caroline hesitated briefly before continuing. Then she disappeared 6 years ago. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Disappeared how? She withdrew mid-semester. No graduation. No public explanation. Rain tapped softly against the office windows. Ethan continued reading. Research recognition. Faculty commendations. Specialized studies involving emotional processing in neurodivergent children. His jaw tightened slightly. Claire had not simply understood Noah. She had been trained to. Deeply. Professionally. Yet somehow she ended up carrying champagne trays while arrogant executives mocked her in hotel ballrooms. None of it made sense. There is one more thing, Caroline said quietly. Ethan looked up. Her younger brother, Daniel Whitmore, passed away 7 years ago. Something in her tone made Ethan still completely. Cause. Complications following a long-term neurological condition. Ethan lowered his eyes back toward the folder slowly. Neurological condition. Suddenly Claire's voice from the night before echoed differently in his mind. Big rooms feel heavy sometimes. I know that too. Ethan stared out at the rain-covered skyline again. For the first time since Noah's accident, he felt something dangerous beginning to crack beneath the carefully controlled surface of his life. Not attraction. Not curiosity alone. Recognition. Claire Whitmore understood pain without turning it into performance. She carried grief the way some people carried expensive jewelry. Quietly, without asking anyone to notice. His office phone rang sharply, interrupting the silence. Ethan ignored it. Caroline studied him carefully. Do you want me to keep looking into her? Ethan closed the folder slowly. No. He stood and reached for his coat again. I think I would rather ask her myself. Caroline glanced toward the storm outside the windows. You are going back to the hotel? Ethan looked down briefly at the file still resting in his hand. Then toward the rain beyond Manhattan glass towers. No, he said quietly. I think I am going somewhere people usually stop seeing after they become wealthy. The subway station smelled like rain, old concrete, and burnt coffee when Ethan Blackwell stepped onto the downtown platform just after 6 that evening. People moved around him without recognition. A woman in scrubs leaned against a pillar scrolling through her phone. Two construction workers argued quietly near the tracks. Somewhere farther down the station, a violinist played soft jazz beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Ethan could not remember the last time he had taken the subway. Probably before the company became worth billions. Before drivers waited outside every building he entered. Before entire rooms shifted when he walked in. Tonight, he had left the black SUV and security detail 3 blocks away. Something about arriving in another expensive car felt wrong. Claire Whitmore finished her shift at 7:15 according to the hotel manager. Ethan checked his watch once before sliding the black folder back into his coat pocket. He still could not reconcile the woman from the ballroom with the university records he had read that morning. Full scholarship, published research, faculty recognition, then silence. The downtown train screeched into the station with a gust of warm air. People crowded toward the doors immediately. Ethan stepped aside automatically and nearly missed her. Claire stood farther down the platform wearing a simple gray coat and carrying a worn canvas tote bag against her shoulder. Her blonde hair was loose tonight, slightly damp from the rain outside. Without the hotel uniform, she somehow looked even quieter, more real. She did not notice him. She simply boarded the train with everyone else and disappeared into the crowded car. Ethan hesitated only a second before following. The subway rattled through Manhattan beneath rivers of city light, while strangers sat shoulder to shoulder pretending not to look at one another. Claire stood near the center pole, holding onto the overhead rail with one hand, while reading a small paperback book. Ethan remained several feet away, watching the reflections slide across the train windows. No designer handbag, no expensive jewelry, no performance. Just a woman reading quietly after a 12-hour shift while exhausted passengers swayed around her. At the next stop, an older man entered carrying 2 heavy grocery bags. Claire immediately closed her book and offered him her seat without hesitation. The man smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sweetheart." Claire nodded once. "Of course." Ethan looked away toward the dark tunnel outside the windows. Something about that tiny interaction unsettled him more than any business confrontation ever had. People with power were usually loud about kindness. Public. Strategic. Claire moved through the world like nobody owed her recognition for being decent. 20 minutes later, she exited at a quieter neighborhood in Brooklyn lined with old brick buildings and narrow streets still wet from rain. Ethan followed at a distance beneath glowing streetlights while Claire walked past laundromats, corner stores, and small apartment buildings with tired windows. Eventually, she stopped outside a modest brick community center tucked between a pharmacy and a closed bakery. Ethan frowned slightly. The building looked nearly empty except for warm light glowing through basement windows. Claire entered quietly. Curiosity pulled him forward before logic could stop him. Through the lower window near the sidewalk, Ethan finally looked inside and froze. About 8 children sat around folding tables covered in crayons, puzzle pieces, and construction paper, while Claire knelt beside a little girl, helping her stack colored blocks carefully by size. No cameras, no publicity, no audience. The children ranged from maybe 5 to 12 years old. Some spoke loudly. Some rocked gently in their chairs. One boy sat beneath a table humming softly to himself, while another child tapped rhythmically against headphones. Claire moved between them with the same calm patience she had shown Noah. Not rushed, not clinical, human. Ethan watched through the rain-speckled glass as one frustrated little boy suddenly shoved a box of crayons onto the floor. Several children startled at the noise. Claire immediately crouched beside him. She did not scold him. She simply began gathering crayons quietly one by one. Red, blue, green. The boy's breathing slowed as he watched her hands move calmly across the floor. Then he slowly began helping her pick them up himself. Ethan felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. "You planning to stand outside all night?" Ethan turned sharply. An older woman stood near the bakery doorway holding an umbrella. "Excuse me." She nodded toward the community center window. "You have been staring through that glass for 5 minutes." Ethan straightened slightly. "I know someone inside." The woman smiled faintly. "Claire." Ethan hesitated. "Yes." "Then you are not the first person surprised by her." Rain dripped softly from the edge of the umbrella while traffic hissed through the wet street nearby. The woman adjusted her scarf carefully. She has been volunteering here almost every evening for years. Ethan looked back through the basement window. Claire was now helping two children fold paper cranes at one of the tables, while another little girl rested sleepily against her shoulder. "What kind of place is this?" he asked quietly. "Support Center for Children with Sensory and Developmental Conditions," the woman replied. "Most families around here cannot afford private therapy." Ethan stared through the glass again. "And she works here for free? Every week?" The older woman smiled softly. "Some people heal by talking. Claire heals by staying useful." The sentence settled heavily into the cold evening air. Inside the basement room, one little boy suddenly laughed loudly at something Claire whispered to him. The sound carried faintly through the glass window. Claire laughed too, quietly, warmly. It was the first time Ethan had seen her smile, without sadness hiding behind it. For a moment, the billionaire standing alone in the rain forgot entirely about stock markets, acquisitions, and boardrooms high above Manhattan. Because down in a basement filled with paper cranes and tired folding tables, the woman everyone dismissed as ordinary was changing lives without asking anyone to notice. The rain had stopped by the time Claire Whitmore finally stepped out of the community center just after 9:30 that night. The sidewalks still shimmered beneath streetlights, reflecting gold against puddles and cracked concrete. She adjusted the strap of her canvas tote bag and pulled her gray coat tighter against the cold October air before stopping suddenly. Ethan Blackwell still stood across the street beside the bakery window. For one brief second, genuine surprise crossed her face. "Mr. Blackwell?" Ethan looked almost uncomfortable being caught there. Strange for a man who controlled billion-dollar negotiations without blinking. "I did not mean to startle you." Claire glanced toward the community center behind her. "How long have you been standing there?" Ethan considered lying, then decided against it. "Long enough to realize you are not who you pretend to be." The words hung softly between them while distant traffic moved through wet Brooklyn streets. Claire studied him quietly for a moment before exhaling through a faint, tired smile. "That sounds dramatic." "It is accurate." She shifted the tote bag slightly against her shoulder. "You followed me?" Ethan looked down briefly. "Yes." Claire should have sounded angry, suspicious. Instead, she simply nodded once as though wealthy men struggling with curiosity no longer surprised her. "And what exactly were you hoping to find?" Ethan glanced toward the basement windows where paper decorations still hung crookedly inside the community center. "Honestly," Claire waited. "I am not sure." The honesty caught her off guard more than the answer itself. Ethan rarely admitted uncertainty to anyone. Yet around Claire, carefully rehearsed confidence kept dissolving in inconvenient ways. A cold breeze moved down the street, carrying the distant smell of coffee and wet pavement. Claire finally looked away first. "The children left about 30 minutes ago." "I know. You stayed anyway." Ethan's expression shifted slightly. "Apparently, I am learning from someone." Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the sidewalk. There it was again, that strange ache beneath his words. Not flirtation. Something quieter. Regret, maybe. "You should not romanticize what you saw in there," she said softly. "It is just tutoring and support work." That little boy laughing inside did not look like just tutoring. Claire remained silent. Ethan stepped closer slowly, careful not to crowd her. "Why did you leave Columbia?" Her posture changed instantly. Small, almost invisible, but Ethan noticed. Claire looked toward the dark street instead of answering. "You read my records. I read enough to know you walked away from something important." People walk away from things every day, not from a full scholarship and published research. Claire's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Ethan immediately regretted pushing too hard. The city hummed quietly around them while neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Claire sighed softly. "My brother got sick." Ethan listened carefully. "Daniel?" Her eyes flickered upward in surprise. "You really did investigate me." "Only because none of this made sense." Claire gave a faint, humorless smile. "Life rarely does." She looked toward the community center windows again. Daniel was 8 when doctors finally diagnosed him. Sensory processing disorder, severe anxiety, communication difficulties. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, hearing Noah reflected quietly inside those words. "My parents worked constantly trying to pay for treatments," Claire continued. "Insurance covered almost nothing back then. Therapy appointments, specialists, medications. Everything cost more money than we had. Her voice never broke. That somehow made it sadder. So you studied behavioral psychology for him? Claire nodded once. I wanted to learn how to help him myself. Ethan stared at her carefully beneath the streetlight glow. You were trying to save your brother. She swallowed slowly. I was trying to make the world less loud for him. The sentence settled over the empty sidewalk like soft rain. Ethan suddenly understood why Noah trusted her so quickly. Claire spoke about overwhelmed children the way survivors speak about storms they barely escaped themselves. What happened? He asked quietly. Claire's eyes lowered again. Daniel died during my second year at Columbia. Ethan felt the cold air leave his lungs. Claire continued before sympathy could interrupt her. After that, classrooms started feeling meaningless. Her fingers trembled slightly against the canvas bag strap. Everyone kept talking about theories and clinical models while my brother was gone. Ethan looked at her differently then, not as someone who failed to finish her education, but as someone grief had rearranged completely. Claire blinked once and gathered herself quickly. The community center director gave me part-time work after the funeral. I stayed. For 6 years. Children still need help whether I finished my degree or not. Ethan shook his head slowly. You could be running major research programs right now. Claire smiled sadly. And miss teaching paper cranes to 6-year-olds? Ethan almost smiled too. Almost. A siren echoed faintly somewhere deeper in Brooklyn while wind rustled through trees lining the sidewalk. Claire glanced at the time on her phone. I should go. Ethan nodded automatically, though something in him resisted the idea immediately. Claire noticed. What? She asked softly. Ethan hesitated longer than usual, then finally admitted the truth. I think Noah needs you. Claire's expression changed at once. Concern replaced distance immediately. Is he all right? He asked about you this morning. A softness touched her face before she could hide it. Ethan stepped slightly closer. He has not connected with anyone like this since losing his parents. Claire looked away quietly toward the wet streetlights. Children do not always need fixing, she whispered. Sometimes they just need someone who stays long enough for them to feel safe again. Ethan stared at her in silence, because somehow the sentence felt larger than Noah alone. Larger than childhood trauma. Larger even than grief. It sounded like the kind of truth someone only learned by surviving abandonment themselves. Claire finally stepped backward toward the subway entrance. Good night, Mr. Blackwell. Ethan watched her carefully. Would you come see Noah again? Claire hesitated beneath the streetlight glow while distant subway thunder rolled beneath the city. Then she answered softly, if he asks. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwell realized he wanted something money could not immediately buy. 3 days later, the Blackwood penthouse no longer felt as cold. Ethan noticed it first in the mornings. The silence had changed. Before, it had been heavy, careful, the kind of silence that forms when grief settles into expensive walls and nobody knows how to move around it anymore. Now there were small interruptions. Noah asking questions at breakfast. Soft footsteps moving through the hallway instead of hiding from it. Once, Ethan even heard quiet humming drifting from the living room while rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking Central Park. He stopped outside the doorway immediately. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor beside the coffee table folding paper napkins into crooked birds while Claire Whitmore sat nearby in a simple cream sweater with her sleeves rolled carefully to her elbows. She was teaching him patiently. Fold the corners slowly, she said softly. The paper listens when you rush. Noah frowned in concentration. Paper cannot listen. Claire tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe not, but people can feel when hands are nervous. Noah looked down at his folded paper crane again and carefully slowed his movements. Ethan remained silent in the hallway watching them longer than he intended. Claire had started visiting the penthouse 2 afternoons a week after Noah specifically requested her. Ethan originally offered payment, a generous amount. Claire refused immediately. I am not a therapist, she told him calmly. Then what are you? Ethan had asked before thinking. Claire looked toward Noah sitting quietly by the piano that afternoon. Someone who understands what overwhelmed children sound like when they stop speaking. Since then, something subtle had shifted inside the apartment. Noah still had difficult moments. Loud sounds still overwhelmed him sometimes. Crowded places still frightened him. But now he recovered faster. Claire never forced conversation from him. She simply existed beside him long enough for silence to stop feeling dangerous. Ethan watched her carefully every visit. The small routines, counting raindrops against windows. Soft piano notes repeated slowly until Noah copied them. Breathing exercises disguised as games. One afternoon, she taught him how to hold warm tea between both hands whenever anxiety made his thoughts feel too loud. Heat tells your body you are safe, she explained quietly. Noah listened to her the way exhausted people listen to rain after a storm. Ethan had built companies worth billions of dollars. Yet somehow this woman fixed fractures inside rooms simply by lowering her voice. You are staring again. Ethan looked up sharply from the hallway. Claire had noticed him without turning around. Noah smiled slightly at the paper bird in his hands. Ethan stepped into the room awkwardly. I did not mean to interrupt. Claire gave him a faint knowing look. You never interrupt. You hover. Noah giggled quietly into his sweater sleeve. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I am being insulted in my own home now. Observation is not insult, Claire replied calmly. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. He walked toward the kitchen counter where untouched coffee had gone cold beside financial reports he still had not finished reading. Caroline says the board thinks I am distracted lately. Claire folded another paper napkin carefully. Are you? Ethan looked toward Noah sitting peacefully beside her. Yes. The honesty slipped out before he could stop it. Claire glanced up briefly. Something unreadable passed through her expression before disappearing again. That is not always a bad thing. Noah suddenly held up his folded crane proudly. It looks weird. Claire studied it seriously. It looks brave. Brave. It kept going even after the folds got messy. Noah thought about that carefully. Ethan stared at Claire longer than he should have. Because somehow she always spoke about broken things with kindness instead of disappointment. His phone buzzed sharply against the marble kitchen counter, breaking the quiet warmth of the room. Ethan glanced down. The hospital administrator. He answered immediately. Blackwell. The voice on the other end sounded tense. Mr. Blackwell, I apologize for disturbing you, but there is an issue regarding the pediatric therapy funding review. Ethan's expression hardened automatically. Business mode. Control. Claire noticed the shift immediately. What issue? Ethan asked coldly. The administrator hesitated. Several community outreach programs may need temporary suspension until the board finalizes next quarter budgeting. Claire's hands stopped moving entirely. Ethan turned slightly away while listening. Which programs? The administrator listed several names quickly. Then one made Claire go still beside the piano. Brooklyn Child Development Support Center. Ethan looked toward her immediately. Claire lowered her eyes toward the paper bird in Noah's hands. Her face remained calm, but her fingers tightened almost invisibly around the folded napkin beside her. How many children use the center? Ethan asked quietly into the phone. Approximately 62 families, sir. Ethan's jaw tightened. And you are planning to suspend funding before winter? Only temporarily. Ethan stared at Claire across the room, while Noah carefully adjusted the bent paper wings of his crane. He suddenly remembered the basement filled with folding tables and tired fluorescent lights. Children who could not afford private therapy. Claire staying every evening after exhausting hotel shifts simply because nobody else would. Do not suspend anything, Ethan said flatly. The administrator sounded surprised. Sir, in fact, double the funding allocation. Silence crackled briefly through the phone line. Double. Ethan never looked away from Claire. Effective immediately. He ended the call before further discussion could begin. The apartment fell quiet again except for distant rain brushing against the windows. Noah looked between them curiously. Claire finally spoke softly. You did not have to do that. Ethan walked slowly back toward the piano. Yes, he said quietly. I think I did. Claire looked down at the paper crane in her hands. Most wealthy people donate because they want recognition. Ethan stopped beside the piano. And what if I am tired of being the kind of person who only notices suffering once it reaches my own table? Claire looked up at him then. Really looked at him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Noah suddenly placed the crooked paper bird carefully into Ethan's hand. It is brave now, he whispered. Ethan stared down at the uneven folds while something unfamiliar tightened painfully inside his chest. Because for the first time in years, the billionaire who controlled entire industries realized he had spent most of his life building powerful things while completely forgetting how to stay soft around broken ones. Winter arrived quietly over Manhattan. The trees below the Blackwood penthouse turned silver beneath early December frost, while soft snow drifted between skyscrapers like falling ash. Inside the apartment, warm piano notes moved gently through the living room for the first time in nearly 2 years. Ethan stopped in the hallway the moment he heard them. Noah sat beside the grand piano with Claire next to him, guiding his fingers slowly across the keys. "Too fast," she whispered softly. "Music breathes too." Noah tried again. Slower this time. The simple melody stumbled at first before finally settling into something recognizable. Claire smiled faintly. "See? The notes sound less scared now." Noah looked proud for exactly 3 seconds before hiding behind his sweater sleeve again. Ethan leaned quietly against the doorway watching them. These moments had become dangerous to him lately. Small moments. Noah asking for pancakes instead of skipping breakfast. Paper cranes scattered across the penthouse library. Soft laughter drifting beneath rainstorms. Claire moving through rooms like calm water, while grief slowly loosened its grip on the apartment walls. She never demanded attention. Somehow that made everyone notice her more. "You are hovering again." Ethan looked up as Claire glanced toward the doorway, without stopping the piano lesson. Noah grinned slightly. Ethan folded his arms. "Apparently, I have a reputation now." "You earned it," Claire replied calmly. Noah pressed another piano key softly. "Uncle Ethan watches people when he worries." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And when exactly did you become an expert on me?" Noah looked down at the keys thoughtfully. "You walk quieter now." The sentence hit harder than Ethan expected. Claire noticed his expression immediately, but said nothing. She simply returned her attention to the piano. "One more time," she told Noah softly. Ethan stepped farther into the room while the melody started again. Imperfect. Hesitant. Beautiful anyway. He looked toward Claire carefully. "Can I speak with you for a minute?" Noah immediately looked nervous. Claire noticed too. "I am not leaving," she assured him gently. "We are just talking." Noah nodded slowly and returned to the piano keys, while Ethan led Claire toward the kitchen overlooking snow-covered Manhattan streets. Warm light reflected softly against marble counters, while distant traffic hummed below the penthouse windows. Ethan poured coffee automatically before remembering Claire preferred tea. He reached for the kettle instead, without asking. Claire noticed that too. "You remembered." Ethan glanced toward her. "You always hold the mug with both hands before drinking it." Claire looked briefly surprised by the observation, then strangely quiet. Ethan handed her the tea carefully. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Nothing dramatic. Still, something shifted softly in the silence afterward. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug immediately. "What did you want to talk about?" Ethan leaned against the counter. For once, the billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions looked uncertain. "The community center board contacted me this morning." Claire's expression tightened slightly. "Why?" "They want to expand the program." She stared at him carefully. "And?" Ethan reached for a folder resting nearby on the counter. "I want you to run it." Claire blinked once. "What?" "Full funding. New facilities. Staff. Therapy resources. Educational outreach." Ethan slid the folder gently toward her. "Everything they have needed for years." Claire did not touch it. "Mr. Blackwell, Ethan." She paused. "Ethan, I am not qualified to run an organization like that. You are more qualified than anyone I have met." Claire shook her head immediately. "No, I left school. You left grief, not intelligence." The words settled quietly between them. Claire looked away toward the snow drifting outside the windows. Ethan stepped closer slowly. "You already spend every free hour helping children who feel invisible. That does not make me a director." "No," Ethan said softly. "It makes you the kind of person children trust before titles even matter." Claire lowered her eyes toward the untouched folder. Ethan could almost see the conflict moving quietly behind her expression. Hope mixed with fear. The kind people carried after losing too much too young. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Ethan answered honestly, because somehow lying around Claire had become impossible. "Because I spent most of my life building things that looked impressive from far away." His voice lowered slightly. "And then you walked into a ballroom carrying a silver tray and reminded me what actually matters." Claire looked up slowly. The city lights reflected softly in her blue eyes. "You barely knew me." "I know enough." Silence filled the kitchen gently while snow brushed against the glass windows beyond them. Ethan spoke again before caution could stop him. "I also owe you an apology." Claire frowned slightly. "For what?" Ethan looked down briefly at his hands. That night at the gala, his jaw tightened almost invisibly. I heard them humiliate you. Claire remained still, and I said nothing. The honesty in his voice removed all distance from the sentence. No corporate polish. No billionaire composure. Just regret. Real and unguarded. Claire looked toward the steam rising softly from her tea mug. Most people stayed quiet. I should not have. Ethan's voice dropped lower. Noah was watching me, and I failed both of you in that moment. Claire stared at him for a long second without speaking. Then finally she whispered something so softly Ethan almost missed it. The strange thing is, I think you are the first person who ever apologized for silence. Ethan felt something painful move through his chest again. Claire looked down at the folder one more time. I cannot accept this because you feel guilty. That is not why I am offering it. Then why? Ethan met her eyes fully. Because children like Noah deserve someone who understands them before the world teaches them to feel broken. The apartment fell quiet except for faint piano notes drifting from the living room. Noah was still practicing carefully by himself. Slow notes. Breathing notes. Claire closed her eyes briefly as if steadying something fragile inside her. Then she finally whispered, "You really believe I can do this?" Ethan looked at her the same way Noah looked at folded paper cranes. Not for perfection. For courage. I think, he said softly, you have been doing it all along. By early spring, the new center stood quietly on a corner street in Brooklyn where an abandoned pharmacy used to be. Large windows now filled the building with warm afternoon light instead of dust. Paper birds hung gently from the ceiling near the entrance while children's artwork covered the walls in uneven colors and crooked shapes. There was no gold plaque outside. No dramatic ribbon-cutting ceremony. Claire Whitmore refused both. The children do not need another building named after wealthy people, she told Ethan calmly during planning meetings. So the sign above the door, simply read the quiet room. Ethan had stared at the name for a long moment the first time he saw it installed, because somehow those 3 words explained Claire better than anything else ever could. Inside the center, children moved through sensory rooms painted in soft colors while therapists spoke gently instead of loudly. Parents drank coffee in waiting areas without looking ashamed for once. Volunteers folded blankets in the corner near the reading area, while Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, helping a little boy stack puzzle pieces by color. Ethan watched everything from the hallway with quiet disbelief. 6 months earlier, Noah barely spoke above a whisper. Now he greeted children at the front desk every Saturday morning with careful but steady confidence. Not healed completely, not magically transformed, just less afraid of the world. Claire walked beside Ethan carrying folders against her chest while sunlight drifted through the windows behind her. She looked different lately, lighter somehow. The permanent exhaustion around her eyes had softened. She still moved quietly through rooms, still preferred standing near windows instead of center stages. But grief no longer looked like the heaviest thing she carried. "You are staring again," she murmured without looking at him. Ethan almost smiled automatically now whenever she said it. "I am observing leadership." Claire shook her head faintly. "You are impossible." Noah suddenly ran toward them, holding a folded piece of paper carefully in both hands. "Claire," he said breathlessly, "look." She crouched immediately to his level. "What did you make?" Noah handed her the paper proudly. A crooked paper crane. The folds were uneven and one wing bent slightly downward. Claire stared at it like it belonged in a museum. "This is beautiful." Noah frowned. "It is messy." Claire gently fixed the bent wing with her fingertips. "Messy things can still fly." Ethan looked away toward the windows for a moment because something about hearing her say those words still affected him more than he liked admitting. Noah tugged lightly on Claire's sleeve. "Are you staying for the gala tonight?" Claire hesitated briefly. Ethan noticed immediately. The charity gala. Same hotel. Same ballroom. Same crystal chandeliers where everything first began. The board insisted on hosting a fundraising event celebrating the center's official expansion. Claire originally refused to attend. Then Noah quietly asked her himself 3 days earlier. She could never say no to him when he used that hopeful voice. "I will stay for a little while," Claire answered gently. Noah smiled instantly. "Good." That evening, soft golden light filled the ballroom of the Blackwood Grand Hotel once again. Wealthy donors and business leaders gathered beneath shimmering chandeliers, while waiters moved silently between tables carrying champagne glasses. But tonight the atmosphere felt different to Ethan. Less performative, less cold. Perhaps because he finally understood how fragile people could become beneath polished appearances. Claire stood near the back of the ballroom, wearing a dark blue dress simple enough to almost disappear against the crowd. Almost. Ethan noticed her immediately anyway. Several executives approached him throughout the evening, discussing investments and publicity opportunities connected to the center. He answered politely without fully listening. His attention kept drifting toward Claire, standing quietly beside Noah near the stage. Then something unexpected happened. The event host stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. "Before tonight concludes," she announced warmly, "there is one small guest who asked to say something." Ethan frowned slightly. Noah froze beside Claire. "No," he whispered immediately. "It is okay," Claire said softly beside him. "You do not have to." But Noah looked toward the stage with nervous determination. Ethan recognized that expression instantly. Fear mixed with courage. The little boy slowly reached for Claire's hand. "Will you stay?" Claire squeezed his fingers gently. "Always." Noah nodded once and walked toward the stage alone. The ballroom quieted immediately. Hundreds of wealthy strangers turned toward the small boy standing beneath crystal lights. Ethan felt his pulse tighten painfully inside his chest. Noah hated crowds, hated microphones even more. The little boy gripped the podium with both hands while silence spread across the room. For one terrible second, Ethan thought Noah might panic. Then Noah looked toward Claire, standing near the back of the ballroom. She gave the smallest nod. Nothing dramatic, just calm belief. Noah inhaled slowly. "When people get loud," he said softly into the microphone, "it feels like storms inside my head." The ballroom became completely still. Noah swallowed hard, but kept going. "Most people try to make me normal." His small fingers tightened around the podium edge. But Claire never did. Ethan watched Claire lower her eyes quietly as several guests exchanged emotional glances nearby. Noah continued softly. "She taught me quiet people are safe people." Somewhere near the front tables, someone wiped tears discreetly from their eyes. Noah looked toward Claire one last time before whispering the final sentence. "And safe people stay." Silence filled the ballroom afterward. Deep silence. Not awkward. Reverent. Ethan turned slowly toward Claire through the crowd. She stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, while tears shimmered quietly in her blue eyes for the first time since he met her. Not dramatic tears. Grateful ones. The kind that appear when pain finally stops feeling invisible. Around them, applause slowly began building across the ballroom. But Ethan barely heard it. Because months earlier, in this exact room, Claire Whitmore stood silently while wealthy strangers laughed at her like she was forgettable. Tonight, the same room stood for her without her ever asking them to. And somehow that felt bigger than revenge. Bigger than success. Quiet people were never truly ordinary. The world was simply too loud to notice them at first.